I'd like to welcome you to these lectures on Western civilization. This is part one. I thought I'd take a few minutes to talk about the title of this course, to look a little deeper into what Western means, what civilization means, and then why it's divided into two parts. West or Western is a term tossed around by historians and other scholars and sometimes politicians. And we toss it around without giving it much thought, especially with regards to how our students might interpret it. What does the West mean? Does it mean the Wild Wild West with cowboys and Indians? Obviously not. So let's explore this term for a few minutes. Originally, you could look at the West as being that European appendage to the Eurasian continent. China to the east, and Europe to the west. But it goes much deeper and much further than that. The West also denotes an affiliation with Christianity. We think of the Western Roman Empire, an empire that had adapted Christianity, and then of course the Catholic Church becomes an institution of the Western Roman Empire. And once the empire dissolves in the 5th, 6th centuries, as it moves slowly into what we today call feudalism, we describe that portion of the old Western Roman Empire and now a good deal of the European landmass as the West. So you can think of the West as being geographically centered in Europe. You can think of the West as having at its foundation Christianity. You can also think of the West as we move further and further in time as we get closer to the modern age. You can think of the West as having an affiliation with the market economy or with capitalism. Let's face it, quite often Japan and South Korea are thought of, and even Taiwan, are thought of as being part of the West. Not obviously because of Christianity, which they do not practice for the most part, but because they are part of the world capitalist system led by the United States. So the West has just a number of meanings, and we at least should have some understanding of these meanings before we start the course. So geographically, the West, if you try to pin it to Europe or restrict it to Europe, that's a very artificial limitation. Europe, obviously, from the time of Columbus on, spread across the world. The imperial project for the Europeans lasted centuries, and little Europes sprang up in the Western Hemisphere, in both North and South America, and Australia, South Africa, and other places. So it's an artificial limitation to say the West is simply Europe, because the Europeans expanded their civilization and their culture and religion dramatically around the rest of the world. So we're not going to confine ourselves to Europe. In other words, when we talk about Columbus, we're going to start with the Mongol Empire. When we talk about World War II, we obviously have to go far outside the boundaries of Europe. And we talk about imperialism. We're going to talk about New France in North America. So when you think of the West, think of the market economy, think of Christianity, think of those places that the Europeans went to and settled and created little Europes around the world. Now, how about civilization? This is a word that we toss around very casually as well without really thinking about what it means. Civilization is, we think of cities when you think of civilization. You think of urbanization, large groups of people living in a relatively small area. This is a dramatic break from how humans had traditionally lived. In the Paleolithic era, humans were confined to very small bands of people, 30, 40, 50 people, moving about in search of food and water, in search of shelter. This will change, of course, when we enter the Neolithic or the New Stone Age, the Neolithic era. Paleo meaning old Stone Age, Paleolithic. So this dramatic shift is going to give rise to cities. It's going to give rise to specialization among people. These earliest cities we have discovered in Mesopotamia, and what today we would call Iraq and Kuwait, in the Tigris and Euphrates River valleys, or Mesopotamia, the land between the rivers. Cities are going to emerge here after about 10,000 before the Common Era. You're going to find that people will discover that they can grow plants, that they can domesticate grains, and that they can domesticate wild animals, whether they're chickens or cattle or horses or pigs. Once this process begins, again in Mesopotamia, southern Turkey, the Nile River Valley, once this process begins, people will begin to settle down and human population numbers will boom. This, of course, will necessitate certain infrastructure, whether there's city walls, to protect the population, and it will promote specialization. Let's face it, if we have domesticated plants and animals, and we have a way of storing this food, then that frees a lot of people up to do something else besides simply look for food. So specialization is going to arise here. You have people working in leather, people working in metal. You have engineers determining how to control the waterways. You have people wrangling, that is bringing in wild animals and training them and domesticating them. You have the rise of the priesthood. You have the rise of politicians. You need military forces to protect these settlements. So you can see that there's just a wide variety of specializations emerging here. So civilization points to an urban city life with specialization and with stored food. We're going to start the course essentially in Mesopotamia with the ancient city-states of Sumer, and then we'll expand from there. And again, you can already see the confusion. Modern Mesopotamia is located in what we today call the Middle East, and yet historians look at it as the foundation of the West, or Western civilization. So these titles are very slippery, and I want you to be aware of just how useful on the one hand, and on the other hand, vague enough to allow us to do pretty much what we want. Now, the last part of this introduction, we call this part one of Western civilization. It's divided, as many history surveys are, into two parts. And generally speaking, these divisions come with Columbus around the 15th century. The key question here is why? Well, Columbus is generally viewed as the decisive turning point in world history, not just Western civilization, but world history as well. Columbus initiates what we call the Columbian Exchange, which we'll talk about in this course. The Columbian Exchange is going to launch us into the pre-modern and then modern eras. It begins what today we call globalization. The world's going to become more and more connected. Goods and services are going to be able to move across the oceans. Markets are going to be created. The Columbian Exchange is going to create a vast economic circuit in the Atlantic. The Atlantic basin is now going to be tied together. South America, North America, Africa, and Europe, all tied in a vast circuit of commerce. This obviously is going to dramatically impact people's lives, not only in the West, but in the Far East as well. Now, Columbus is the breaking point generally when we talk about both Western civilization and quite often if we talk about world history. Columbus is that decisive breaking point because of the remarkable series of changes that will come after Columbus brings the old world and the new world together. So, Western civilization, part one. Like I said, we will not be limited to Europe. We'll go beyond Columbus. We'll talk about some of the major impacts of the Columbian Exchange, which will take us into the 16th and 17th centuries. specifically Atlantic slavery and imperialism. So we can do what we want in this course, as long as we keep in mind that the main focus of the course lies on Western European Christian civilization that will later expand dramatically throughout the world and create European civilizations in places where you would least expect to find them. And also remember the last thing about the market economy. Today, when we think of the West, we think of the market economy. This, of course, goes back to divisions that are much more recent, from the Cold War with capitalist NATO, communist Warsaw Pact. So slippery titles, slippery designations, but useful nevertheless. So that's our introductory lecture on how the course is conceptualized. And thanks for your attention.